In the corridors of power in Yaoundé, something extraordinary has just occurred that reverberates far beyond Cameroon's borders. The Cameroonian Telecommunications Regulatory Agency has delivered a resounding message to multinational telecommunications giants Orange and MTN, imposing fines totaling nearly €4 million for their systematic failures to serve the Cameroonian people adequately. This is not merely a regulatory action, it represents a profound assertion of African sovereignty in the digital age, a declaration that the era of exploitative corporate practices masquerading as development is drawing to a close. For too long, we have witnessed multinational corporations enter African markets with grand promises of connectivity and progress, only to deliver substandard services while extracting maximum profits. The French telecommunications giant Orange and South African conglomerate MTN, controlling over 80% of Cameroon's telecommunications market, have been caught red-handed in practices that would be unconscionable in their home markets. Yet in Cameroon, they believed they could operate with impunity, delivering inferior coverage while charging premium prices, violating consumer rights with near-total disregard for accountability. What makes this moment particularly significant is not merely the financial penalties, though nearly €4 million represents a substantial deterrent. Rather, it is the assertion of African regulatory authority over foreign corporations that have grown accustomed to operating as quasi-colonial entities, extracting wealth while providing minimal value in return. This action by Cameroon's regulatory authorities signals a new paradigm in African governance, one where African institutions possess both the competence and the courage to hold multinational corporations accountable for their promises and performance. The implications stretch far beyond telecommunications. In an era where digital connectivity has become the backbone of economic development, educational advancement, and social cohesion, Cameroon's stand represents a defense of its people's fundamental right to quality digital infrastructure. This is about sovereignty in its most practical form, the ability of African nations to ensure that foreign investment serves African interests rather than merely extracting African resources. To understand the profound significance of Cameroon's regulatory action, we must situate it within the broader historical trajectory of African telecommunications development and the persistent challenges of neocolonial exploitation. The telecommunications sector in Africa has long been characterized by a complex interplay between promises of modernization and the reality of extractive capitalism, where multinational corporations have positioned themselves as indispensable partners while often delivering inadequate services. The story of African telecommunications begins in the colonial era, when communication infrastructure was designed primarily to serve colonial administrative needs and facilitate the extraction of resources to metropolitan centers. This foundational orientation toward external rather than internal connectivity created lasting structural inequalities that persist to this day. When African nations achieved political independence in the 1960s and beyond, they inherited telecommunications systems that were fundamentally oriented toward serving external interests rather than fostering internal development and integration. The liberalization of telecommunications markets across Africa in the 1990s and early 2000s was heralded as a transformative moment that would bring competition, innovation, and expanded access to communication services. International financial institutions and development agencies promoted market liberalization as the panacea for Africa's telecommunications challenges, arguing that private sector involvement would deliver efficiency and innovation that state-owned enterprises allegedly could not provide. This narrative, while containing elements of truth regarding the limitations of some state-owned telecommunications companies, obscured the more complex reality of how multinational corporations would operate in African markets. Orange, the French telecommunications giant, entered numerous African markets as part of a broader strategy to maintain France's economic influence across its former colonies. The company's operations in Africa have been characterized by a complex relationship with French foreign policy objectives, operating as both a commercial entity and an instrument of soft power. Similarly, MTN's expansion across Africa represented South Africa's post-apartheid economic diplomacy, positioning the company as a vehicle for South African commercial influence across the continent. The promise of these multinational telecommunications companies was compelling. They would bring advanced technology, substantial investment, and world-class service standards to African markets. They would create employment opportunities, foster skills development, and contribute to economic growth through improved connectivity. These promises were not entirely empty. Telecommunications liberalization did lead to expanded mobile phone penetration and improved access to communication services across Africa. However, the reality of multinational telecommunications operations in Africa has been far more complex and often problematic. Companies like Orange and MTN have frequently operated with different service standards in African markets compared to their operations in Europe or other developed markets. They have charged premium prices for services that would be considered substandard in their home markets, justified by claims about the challenging operating environment in Africa while simultaneously reporting substantial profits from their African operations. The regulatory environment in many African countries has struggled to keep pace with the rapid evolution of telecommunications technology and business practices. Regulatory agencies have often lacked the technical expertise, financial resources, and political support necessary to hold multinational corporations accountable for their service commitments. This regulatory weakness has created an environment where companies could make ambitious promises to secure market access, and then under-deliver on those commitments with minimal consequences. Cameroon's current regulatory action against Orange and MTN must be understood within this broader context of regulatory evolution and growing African assertiveness in holding multinational corporations accountable. The Cameroonian Telecommunications Regulatory Agency's decision to impose substantial fines represents a maturation of African regulatory capacity and a growing confidence in challenging corporate practices that would be unacceptable in developed markets. The specifics of Cameroon's regulatory action reveal a sophisticated understanding of corporate accountability that deserves careful examination. The fines imposed on Orange and MTN are not arbitrary penalties, but rather targeted responses to specific violations that demonstrate a pattern of systematic underperformance and consumer rights violations. This precision in regulatory action reflects a level of institutional competence that challenges stereotypes about African regulatory capacity. Orange Cameroon faces the most substantial penalties, totaling approximately 2.74 million euros across multiple violations. The largest fine, 2.44 million euros, addresses the company's failure to meet coverage and service quality obligations as specified in their operating agreements. This violation strikes at the heart of the telecommunications social contract. Companies receive exclusive or semi-exclusive access to spectrum and market opportunities in exchange for commitments to provide adequate coverage and service quality to the population. Orange's failure to meet these obligations represents a fundamental breach of trust with both the regulatory authority and the Cameroonian people. The additional €304,898 fine for non-compliance with pricing rules reveals another dimension of corporate misconduct. Pricing violations in telecommunications typically involve either charging rates above regulated maximums or failing to provide transparent pricing information to consumers. These violations are particularly egregious in markets where consumers have limited alternatives and where telecommunications services are essential for economic participation and social connection. Perhaps most revealing is the specific criticism of Orange Cameroon's handling of service unsubscription processes. The regulatory authority's identification of malfunctions in unsubscription procedures that violate consumer rights points to a deliberate strategy of making it difficult for consumers to cancel services they no longer want or need. This practice, sometimes referred to as dark patterns in digital services, represents a particularly exploitative approach to customer relations that treats consumers as captive revenue sources rather than valued clients. MTN Cameroon's fine of €1.52 million for coverage and service quality shortcomings reflects similar issues, though the company appears to have avoided the pricing and unsubscription violations that compounded Orange's penalties. Nevertheless, MTN's failures in basic service delivery obligations demonstrate that the problems in Cameroon's telecommunications sector are systemic rather than isolated to a single operator. The regulatory authorities' approach demonstrates remarkable sophistication in several key areas. First, the timing of the inspections in April and May 2024 suggests a coordinated and systematic evaluation process rather than reactive enforcement. This proactive approach to regulation indicates institutional maturity and planning capacity that enables effective oversight of multinational corporations. Second, the specificity of the violations identified suggests that Cameroon's regulatory agency possesses the technical expertise necessary to evaluate complex telecommunications performance metrics. The identification of coverage rates below the thresholds required in the specifications indicates detailed technical monitoring capabilities that can hold companies accountable for their performance commitments. Third, the regulatory authorities' willingness to impose substantial financial penalties demonstrates political support for enforcement actions that protect consumer interests even when they conflict with powerful multinational corporations. This political backing is crucial for effective regulation, as multinational corporations often possess significant lobbying capabilities and political influence that can undermine regulatory enforcement. The pattern of repeated violations is particularly significant. The regulatory authority notes that similar fines totaling approximately €9.15 million were imposed on telecommunications operators in May 2023, yet service quality problems persist. This pattern suggests that previous penalties were insufficient to motivate meaningful improvements in service delivery, necessitating stronger enforcement measures. The persistence of service quality problems, despite substantial previous penalties, reveals the limitations of purely financial enforcement mechanisms. While fines can serve as deterrents and send important signals about regulatory seriousness, they may be insufficient to address systemic problems in corporate culture and business practices. The regulatory authorities' observation that significant investments announced by the operators have not translated into satisfactory service improvements suggests that the problems may be rooted in business model priorities rather than simple resource constraints. The market concentration issue cannot be overlooked in this analysis. Orange and MTN's control of over 80% of Cameroon's telecommunications market creates a duopoly situation that limits consumer choice and competitive pressure for service improvements. This market structure makes regulatory enforcement even more crucial, as consumers have limited alternatives when faced with poor service quality from the dominant providers. The regulatory authorities' hope that these sanctions will serve as a strong signal to operators reflects an understanding that enforcement must be visible and consequential to be effective. In markets dominated by large multinational corporations, regulatory agencies must demonstrate both the capacity and willingness to impose meaningful penalties for violations. This visibility is essential not only for deterring future violations, but also for maintaining public confidence in regulatory institutions. The regulatory action taken by Cameroon against Orange and MTN reverberates across multiple dimensions of African geopolitics, challenging established power structures and signaling a potential transformation in how African nations engage with multinational corporations. This development must be understood not merely as a domestic regulatory matter, but as part of a broader assertion of African sovereignty in the digital economy. The targeting of Orange, a French telecommunications giant, carries particular geopolitical significance given France's historical and contemporary relationship with Cameroon. France's economic influence in its former colonies has long been maintained through networks of French corporations operating across sectors from telecommunications to banking to natural resources. Orange's operations in Africa have been integral to France's strategy of maintaining economic influence across Francophone Africa, providing both commercial returns and strategic leverage. Cameroon's willingness to impose substantial fines on Orange represents a significant departure from the historically deferential approach that many Francophone African nations have taken toward French corporate interests. This shift reflects growing confidence among African regulatory institutions and a diminishing tolerance for the kind of differential treatment that has characterized French corporate operations in Africa. the implications extend beyond bilateral Franco-Cameroonian relations to the broader question of how African nations engage with former colonial powers in the contemporary era. Cameroon's action suggests that African regulatory authorities are increasingly willing to prioritize domestic consumer protection over maintaining comfortable relationships with foreign corporations, even when those corporations originate from historically influential partner countries. MTN's inclusion in the regulatory action adds another layer of geopolitical complexity. As a South African company, MTN represents the expansion of South African capital across Africa, a phenomenon that has been central to South Africa's post-apartheid economic diplomacy. However, MTN's operations across Africa have sometimes been characterized by the same kind of extractive practices that have historically characterized European corporate operations on the continent. The fact that both a European and a South African multinational corporation have been held accountable simultaneously sends a clear message that Cameroon's regulatory authorities are not making distinctions based on the national origin of foreign investors. This approach suggests a mature understanding that corporate accountability should be based on performance and compliance rather than geopolitical considerations. The regulatory action also has implications for China's growing presence in African telecommunications markets. Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE have become increasingly prominent in African telecommunications infrastructure, often offering more competitive pricing and more flexible financing arrangements than their European counterparts. Cameroon's demonstration of regulatory strength may influence how Chinese companies approach their African operations, knowing that they too will be held accountable for their performance commitments. The timing of this regulatory action coincides with broader discussions about digital sovereignty across Africa. The African Union's digital transformation strategy emphasizes the importance of African ownership and control over digital infrastructure and services. Cameroon's regulatory action aligns with these broader continental aspirations by demonstrating that African regulatory institutions can effectively oversee foreign corporations operating in critical digital sectors. The precedent established by Cameroon's actions may inspire similar regulatory assertiveness in other African countries where telecommunications companies have underperformed. Regional regulatory networks and continental organizations may begin to coordinate more effectively to ensure that multinational corporations meet consistent standards across African markets. The response of international investors and development partners to Cameroon's regulatory action will be closely watched across Africa. If the international community responds positively to what should be understood as legitimate regulatory enforcement, it may encourage similar actions elsewhere. However, if there are attempts to characterize this as regulatory overreach or investment climate deterioration, it may reveal persistent double standards in how African regulatory actions are perceived. The broader implications for African economic integration also deserve consideration. Effective regulation of telecommunications services is essential for the success of continental initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, which depends on reliable digital infrastructure for trade facilitation and economic coordination. Cameroon's regulatory action contributes to building the kind of institutional capacity that will be necessary for successful continental economic integration. The demonstration of regulatory competence also has implications for Africa's position in global technology governance discussions. As debates about digital taxation, data localization, and platform regulation intensify globally, African countries with demonstrated regulatory capacity will be better positioned to participate meaningfully in these discussions and to ensure that global digital governance frameworks serve African interests. The cultural implications of Cameroon's regulatory action extend far beyond the technical aspects of telecommunications regulation, touching on fundamental questions of cultural identity, communication practices, and the role of digital technology in contemporary African society. Understanding these cultural dimensions is essential for appreciating the full significance of this regulatory intervention and its potential impact on Cameroonian society. Telecommunications services in contemporary Africa serve as more than mere communication tools. They have become integral to cultural expression, social organization, and economic participation. Mobile phones and digital connectivity have transformed how Africans maintain family relationships, conduct business, access information, and participate in political discourse. The quality of telecommunications services therefore directly impacts the vitality of cultural and social life across African communities. In Cameroon, a country characterized by remarkable linguistic and cultural diversity, telecommunications services play a crucial role in maintaining connections across different communities and regions. The country's bilingual character, with both French and English as official languages, creates particular challenges for telecommunications service providers who must serve diverse linguistic communities with different communication patterns and preferences. The inadequate service quality that prompted regulatory action has cultural implications that extend beyond mere consumer inconvenience. When telecommunication services fail to provide reliable coverage, they undermine the ability of Cameroonian communities to maintain the social networks that are fundamental to African cultural life. Extended family relationships, which remain central to social organization across Africa, depend increasingly on digital communication to maintain connections across geographic distances. The regulatory authority's specific criticism of Orange's unsubscription practices reveals a cultural dimension of corporate exploitation that deserves particular attention. The deliberate creation of barriers to service cancellation preys on cultural values that emphasize politeness and conflict avoidance, making it difficult for consumers to assert their rights in the face of corporate obstinacy. This exploitation of cultural characteristics for commercial gain represents a particularly insidious form of corporate misconduct. The youth dimension of telecommunications access carries particular cultural significance in contemporary Africa. Young Africans have embraced digital technology as a means of cultural expression, economic opportunity, and social connection. The failure of telecommunications companies to provide adequate service quality disproportionately impacts young people who depend on digital connectivity for education, employment, and social participation. The regulatory action also reflects evolving expectations about corporate behavior in African markets. Cameroonian consumers, like their counterparts across Africa, are increasingly sophisticated in their understanding of service quality standards and consumer rights. This sophistication reflects both improved education and increased exposure to global standards through digital connectivity, creating a feedback loop where better telecommunications access leads to higher expectations for service quality. The cultural significance of regulatory assertiveness cannot be overlooked. By holding multinational corporations accountable for their performance, Cameroon's regulatory authorities are demonstrating that African institutions possess the competence and authority to protect African interests. This demonstration of institutional capability has important implications for cultural confidence and self-perception. The multilingual nature of Cameroon's population creates particular challenges for telecommunications service providers, who must provide customer service and technical support in multiple languages. The regulatory violations identified by the authorities may reflect inadequate attention to linguistic diversity in service delivery, a problem that has broader implications for cultural inclusivity in digital services. Cameroon's decisive regulatory action against Orange and MTN represents far more than a routine enforcement measure. It embodies a profound assertion of African sovereignty in the digital age and a rejection of the extractive practices that have too long characterized multinational corporate operations across the continent. This moment demands our recognition and support as part of a broader movement toward African self-determination and institutional maturity. The nearly €4 million in fines imposed on these telecommunications giants sends an unmistakable message. The era of substandard service delivery and consumer exploitation in African markets is drawing to a close. African regulatory institutions possess both the technical competence and political will necessary to hold multinational corporations accountable for their commitments and performance. This regulatory assertiveness represents a maturation of African governance that deserves celebration and support. The broader implications of this action extend far beyond telecommunications regulation. Cameroon's demonstration of regulatory strength contributes to a continental movement toward greater African agency in economic governance and corporate accountability. As other African nations witness the success of strong regulatory enforcement, they may be inspired to adopt similar approaches in their own markets, creating a network of institutional capacity that can effectively oversee multinational corporate operations. The cultural and social dimensions of this regulatory action cannot be overlooked. By ensuring that telecommunications companies provide adequate service quality, Cameroon's authorities are protecting the digital rights of their citizens and supporting the cultural vitality that depends on reliable communication infrastructure. This protection of digital citizenship represents a fundamental assertion of African dignity and self-respect. As we witness these developments, we must recognize our role in supporting African sovereignty movements through our engagement and advocacy. The success of regulatory actions like Cameroon's depends partly on international recognition and support for legitimate African governance initiatives. Our engagement with content that celebrates African institutional capacity and sovereign decision-making contributes to a global narrative that recognizes African competence and agency. The future of African telecommunications, and indeed African development more broadly, depends on continued institutional strengthening and regulatory assertiveness. Cameroon's action provides a model for other African nations and demonstrates that effective governance can create the conditions for genuine development that serves African interests rather than merely extracting African resources. I encourage you to support this channel's mission of highlighting African sovereignty movements and institutional successes by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and ringing the notification bell to stay updated on the latest developments in African geopolitics and governance. Your engagement helps amplify African voices and perspectives in global discussions about development, governance, and sovereignty. Share this video with others who care about African development and sovereignty. Each share contributes to building a global community that recognizes and supports African agency and self-determination. Together, we can help shift global narratives about Africa